Jace nodded, rallying a group of fighters to join them. The rebels and humans split into smaller teams, each working to cover different sections of the battlefield. The sound of explosions was deafening as both sides clashed in the full fury of war. As they moved toward the north side, Turin could feel the heat of the battle intensifying. The HFY weapon that had been causing so much damage came into view. A massive hovering machine that shot beams of pure energy, disintegrating everything in its path. Its defenses were nearly impenetrable, and its weapons were devastating. "We can't waste any more time," Turin said, her voice tight with urgency. "We take that thing out now." The rebel team moved into position, taking cover behind ruined buildings and boulders. The humans provided support with airstrikes, trying to weaken the HFY weapon before the rebels closed in. Turin glanced over at Hall, who was coordinating the airstrikes. His face was focused, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. "We're almost there," he called to her. "We've got one shot at this." Turin nodded. "Make it count." They emerged from cover, charging toward the HFY weapon with everything they had. The air crackled with energy as they sprinted through the battlefield, dodging blasts from enemy tanks and soldiers. The HFY weapon's attention was on the humans in the sky, leaving them a small window of opportunity. Turin and her team reached the weapon's base, planting explosives along its structure. "Get back," she shouted as she hit the detonator. The explosion that followed was deafening. The weapon erupted into a ball of fire, its systems failing as the energy was released in a shockwave that rattled the ground beneath their feet. The HFY forces staggered, confused, as the weapon went down. The rebels and humans seized the moment. With their advantage gained, they pushed forward, relentless in their assault. HFY war machines crumbled beneath the combined firepower of the humans and rebels, and the HFY soldiers began to retreat, realizing they had been bested. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high, so many lives lost in the fight. Turin looked around at the battlefield, her heart heavy with the weight of the sacrifice. But despite the losses, they had won. The HFY were retreating. Kaldor had been saved for now. As the dust settled and the battle wound down, Turin stood with Hall, watching the remaining HFY forces flee into the sky. "It's over," Turin said quietly, though her voice was filled with exhaustion and relief. Hall looked at her, his expression softening. "For now. But this is just the beginning. The war with the HFY is far from over." Turin nodded, her gaze steady. "We've won today, and tomorrow we'll fight again, together." As the sun set over the battlefield, Turin knew the war was far from finished. But for the first time in a long while, she had hope. With humanity at their side, the rebels could face whatever came next. They would continue the fight, not just for Kaldor, but for every world that HFY threatened. And they would never stop fighting until the galaxy was free. Hall nodded, and the commanders began to discuss the details of the plan. Turin stepped back, her thoughts lingering on the quiet before the storm. The calm of these few days had been a temporary reprieve, and the next battle would test the Alliance in ways they hadn't imagined. As night fell over the camp, Turin found herself standing outside, looking up at the stars. The human ships still hovered high above, their engines humming softly in the silence of the night. For the first time, she wasn't looking up in desperation, wondering when help would come. Now she was looking up with a different kind of hope, a fragile hope that the alliance they had built would be enough. But even as she tried to feel reassured, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that HFY weren't going to back down easily, and neither would humanity. Both sides had committed to the fight, but they would have to rely on each other more than ever before. As she turned back toward the command center, she couldn't help but think of the people waiting for her to return with good news. Her people, the rebels. They had trusted her, followed her through every battle, every hardship. And now, with humanity at their side, she had to lead them into the biggest fight of their lives. The sound of distant gunfire echoed from the northern front, a stark reminder that peace was never permanent in times of war. The storm was coming, and this time there would be no retreat. The final stand. The war had led them to this moment, this final confrontation. After weeks of planning, the time had come. The united forces of humanity and the rebel fighters stood ready to face the T-Rex in the battle that would decide the fate of Kaldor and possibly the entire galaxy. The alliance had been forged, but it was still fragile. If they failed now, everything they had fought for would be lost. Terran stood at the front of the assembled forces, her eyes fixed on the distant battlefield. The horizon was littered with the shadows of approaching T-Rex war machines, their dark forms slowly advancing toward the rebel stronghold. The T-Rex had regrouped, and they were stronger than ever. But this time, they wouldn't be fighting alone. Human ships hovered above, their engines humming with power. Their weapon systems were primed, and the ground forces were prepared to move. Terran's heart pounded in her chest as she surveyed the scene. This was it. There would be no second chances. The rebels and humans had to work together seamlessly, or they would all fall. As the ground trembled with the approach of the T-Rex forces, Terran turned to Commander Hall, who stood beside her. "Are the reinforcements in position?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Hall nodded. "They're ready. The first wave of soldiers is positioned on the high ground. We'll have air support as well. The T-Rex won't know what hit them." Terran took a deep breath, looking over her shoulder at the rebel soldiers. They were scared, but they had been through worse. The hope of victory, the thought of pushing the T-Rex off their world, gave them the strength to fight on. It was the same for the humans. They had risked everything to come to Kaldor's aid, and they wouldn't leave without securing victory. The battle began with the distant roar of T-Rex cannons. Their weapons cut through the air, bright flashes of energy lighting up the sky. Terran quickly moved into position with her team, coordinating their efforts with the humans. Rebel fighters and human soldiers fired together, their combined firepower creating a barrage of explosions that sent the first wave of T-Rex soldiers into disarray. But the T-Rex were relentless. Their war machines lumbered forward, impervious to most of the rebel weapons. Terran's mind raced. This wasn't enough. The T-Rex were too strong. They needed to strike at the heart of their forces, take down their command structures, and disrupt their coordination. "Captain," Jace, one of the rebel lieutenants, shouted as he ran up to her. "We've got a problem. They've got a new weapon, something we've never seen before. It's tearing through our defenses." Terran's stomach dropped. A new weapon. The T-Rex had been improving their tactics with every battle. It seemed like no matter what they did, the enemy had a counter. "Where is it?" Terran asked, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "North side of the battlefield," Jace replied, pointing to the direction where the main T-Rex assault was coming from. "It's behind their tanks. We need to take it out before they break through." Terran clenched her fists. "All right, we'll take a squad and flank them. We hit them from the side while their attention is on the front lines." But Terran's thoughts were already turning to the next phase. The battle had been won, but the war would continue. The T-Rex would regroup, and the fight would drag on. "Stay vigilant," Terran muttered to herself, watching the human ships take out the last of the T-Rex units. This isn't over. The human ships slowly began to land, their engines humming as they touched down on Kaldor's surface. The first wave of soldiers disembarked, their advanced armor and weaponry a sign of the strength they brought to the fight. The rebels stood tall beside them, ready to continue the struggle, knowing they were no longer alone. Captain Terran looked out over the battlefield, her heart filled with a mix of relief and determination. They had won today, but the fight was far from over. And now, with humanity's help, they had a fighting chance. A new alliance. The battle had been brutal, but the rebels had done the impossible. They had held the line long enough for humanity to arrive and turn the tide of the war. As the sun began to set over the war-torn landscape of Kaldor, The sounds of distant explosions still echoed in the distance, but the immediate danger had passed. That HFY forces had been driven back. Their invasion halted, at least for now. Terran stood at the front of the battlefield, watching as the human soldiers began to set up their base of operations near the remains of the rebel camp. The contrast between the two groups was striking. Humanity's advanced armor and high-tech equipment against the Galactic rebels in their makeshift gear. Yet despite the difference, there was a bond that had been forged in the heat of battle, a bond that no one could deny. As the human soldiers worked, Terran approached one of their commanders, a tall man with short cropped hair and a stern face. His uniform was a deep navy blue, adorned with symbols of authority that marked him as someone high in the ranks. He looked up when she approached, his expression shifting from one of focus to recognition. "You're Captain Terran, right?" the commander asked, his voice steady. "That's right," she replied, nodding. "Thank you for the help. You got here just in time." The commander gave a brief nod, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "We did what we could, but the real credit goes to you and your people. You held the line longer than anyone thought possible." Terran gave a short, bitter laugh. "We had no choice. We had to." The commander studied her for a moment before speaking again. "We can't do this alone. Kaldor's not the only planet under threat from the Hyrex. We've been fighting them for years, but we've never had a chance to strike back. Now that we've seen what your people are capable of, we have to think bigger." Terran looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "We need an alliance. A true alliance between our forces. We have the technology and the resources, but we've been lacking boots on the ground. Fighters like you. Together, we can push back the Hyrex across the galaxy. But it won't happen if we keep working separately." Terran paused, considering the offer. The thought of joining forces with humanity was a tempting one. After all, they had the technology, the weapons, the ships. But the rebels had fought alone for so long. Could they trust humanity? Would the humans be able to see Kaldor and its people as equals, not just as a war-torn world to be saved? "We've always fought for ourselves," Terran said carefully, her voice tinged with suspicion. "We don't know what your true intentions are. What's in it for us?" The commander's face softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not here to take over your world, Captain. We're here to help. We're all in this fight together now. The Hyrex won't stop with Kaldor. They want to conquer everything. If we don't work together, we'll fall, one planet at a time. But united, we have a real chance of winning this war." Terran's eyes narrowed as she searched the commander's face for any sign of deceit. But there was none. He was telling the truth, as far as she could tell. And despite the fear and uncertainty she had carried for so long, a small spark of hope flickered in her chest. "We'll need time," Terran said after a long pause. "Time to build trust. Time to figure out how this alliance will work. But we'll fight by your side." The commander nodded. "That's all I'm asking for." As the sun sank lower in the sky, Terran looked around at her people. Rebels, warriors, survivors. They had fought and bled together for years, with nothing but their will to survive to keep them going. And now, they were joining forces with humanity. It was a partnership she hadn't expected, but one she knew was necessary for the war ahead. The battle at dawn. The first light of dawn broke across the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the war-torn landscape of Kaldor. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and dust, and the distant rumble of approaching Hyrex forces reverberated through the ground. The rebels had spent the night preparing for battle, their faces grim but resolute. They were ready to fight, but deep down, they all knew the truth. Time was running out. Captain Terran stood at the front of the bunker, her eyes scanning the horizon. The human ships were still high above, their engines silent, as if waiting for something. She had hoped for a miracle, but it seemed like the only thing left to rely on was the strength of the rebels themselves. The Hyrex were getting closer, their massive war machines visible on the horizon. They were an imposing sight. towering structures of metal and alien technology, their weapons designed for destruction. There were thousands of them, and they were closing in fast. Terran turned to the gathered rebels, her voice calm but firm. "We hold the line. No matter what happens, we hold the line. The humans may not be able to land yet, but we will make sure this planet is still here when they can." Jace, standing nearby, gave her a worried look. "How long do we have, Captain? We can't keep them back for long with the limited resources we have." Terran looked at the young rebel, her expression hardening. "We fight as long as we can. We make every second count." The air grew heavier with tension as the rebels took their positions, their makeshift weapons ready. They were vastly outnumbered, but they had something the Cyrex didn't: the will to fight for their world. They would defend Kaldor with everything they had. The first wave of Cyrex soldiers appeared, advancing in tight formation. The rebels fired the first shots, their rifles blasting against the enemy's armor. The Cyrex responded with devastating force, their weapons sending blasts of energy toward the rebels. The ground shook with the force of the explosions, and the air was filled with the sound of gunfire and alien roars. Terran barked orders, keeping the rebels organized and focused. "Take cover. Stay low," she shouted, as she moved swiftly between the barricades, directing fire and returning shots whenever she could. The rebels were fighting with everything they had, but the sheer power of the Cyrex forces seemed unstoppable. Amid the chaos, Jace ran up to her, his face pale. "The supply drop. It's not here yet. We can't hold them off much longer." Terran gritted her teeth, frustration gnawing at her. "We don't need supplies right now. We need to survive. Every minute we buy is one more minute for humanity to get ready. We can't give up. Not now." She turned back to the battlefield, watching the advancing Cyrex. Their massive war machines were getting closer, and the rebels' lines were starting to falter. They were being pushed back. Terran could feel the pressure mounting, but she refused to back down. Then, just as the Cyrex were about to break through the final line of defense, a loud, thunderous sound filled the air. The rebels froze, unsure of what was happening. The ground beneath their feet shook, and the sky above seemed to ripple with power. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. Then, without warning, the human ships dropped from the sky like meteors, their engines roaring as they cut through the atmosphere. The Cyrex forces turned in shock, their attention momentarily diverted as the human ships descended upon them. Terran's heart leaped. This was it. Humanity had finally arrived, and they were bringing their full might to the fight. The human ships unleashed a barrage of energy weapons, their firepower far surpassing anything the rebels had seen. The Cyrex war machines exploded in clouds of fire and debris, their lines shattered in an instant. The rebels, energized by the sudden onslaught, rallied behind the humans, pushing the Cyrex back with newfound strength. "Hold your positions," Terran shouted, her voice filled with hope. "Keep fighting. We're not done yet." The rebel fighters, reinvigorated by the arrival of humanity, pressed forward with a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but the tide was finally turning. The Cyrex were retreating, their forces disorganized by the unexpected assault. It was the break the rebels had needed. As the human ships continued to rain fire down on the Cyrex, Terran looked up at the fleet, feeling a surge of gratitude. Humanity had answered their call. But as the battle raged on, she knew this was just the beginning. The Cyrex might have been pushed back for now, but the war was far from won. The rebels and humanity fought side by side, their combined forces pushing the Cyrex off Kaldor's surface. The sound of battle echoed across the planet, but with every passing minute, the Cyrex were losing ground. Their war machines were destroyed, their soldiers scattered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the screen flickered to life. A shaky, static-filled image appeared, showing a human officer in a military uniform. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with exhaustion. "Captain Terran, we have received your transmission," the officer said, his voice crackling through the speakers. "We are here to assist you, but there's a problem." Taryn felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What problem?" she demanded. The officer hesitated before responding. We weren't expecting the Hyrex to be this powerful. Our fleet is not prepared for a direct confrontation. We don't have enough ships to land and engage. We're trying to come up with a plan, but the situation is more complicated than we anticipated." Taryn's heart sank. This wasn't the answer she had hoped for. The human fleet was here, yes, but they were just as vulnerable as the rebels. Their ships were small, and they didn't have the firepower to take on the Hyrex forces that had been ravaging the planet for years. "So, you're just staying up there?" Taryn asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "You're not going to land. You're not going to help us fight." "We're trying, Captain," the officer replied, his tone filled with frustration. "But we need time. We need to regroup, plan our next move. Our ships are not designed for ground combat. We're trying to find a way to help, but we're not equipped for a full-scale assault." Taryn stared at the screen, her mind reeling. This wasn't the cavalry she had been hoping for. The clock was ticking, and the Hyrex were already mobilizing. She could see the enemy ships on the horizon, their massive forms slowly closing in on the planet's surface. The Hyrex weren't waiting. They were preparing to wipe them out once and for all. The officer continued, his voice now filled with urgency. "Captain, we need your help. We can't do this without you. We're sending you coordinates for a supply drop. We'll give you the resources you need to defend yourselves until we can launch a full assault. But we need you to hold the line." Taryn felt a surge of anger and frustration. They had asked for help, and now humanity was telling them to hold on even longer, without giving them the means to fight back. "You're telling me to wait," she said through gritted teeth. "How long do you think we can last out here? The Hyrex will be on us within hours." The officer's face grew tense. "I understand, Captain. I do. But we're doing everything we can. We're not abandoning you. Please, hold on. We'll be there as soon as we can." The transmission cut out suddenly, leaving Taryn standing in the dim light of the bunker, staring at the empty screen. She clenched her fists, trying to control the fury building inside her. They had come for help, but now it felt like they were being left to fight on their own. "Do they really think we can hold the line?" one of the rebels whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Taryn took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "We don't have a choice. We fight. We do what we've always done. We hold the line until they arrive." The rebels nodded, though the doubt was clear on their faces. They had no choice but to trust that humanity would come through in the end, but the waiting was almost unbearable. Every minute felt like a lifetime, and the weight of the decision to stand and fight pressed heavily on Taryn's shoulders. That night, the sky over Irith was eerily quiet. The human ships remained in orbit, their presence a silent promise that perhaps they would help. But for now, all the rebels could do was prepare. They knew that Hyrex were coming, and when they did, they would need everything they had to survive. Taryn walked to the edge of the bunker, looking out into the darkened sky. The stars were distant, cold, and uncaring. Somewhere up there, humanity's ships were waiting, just as uncertain as the rebels. But despite the fear gnawing at her, Taryn knew one thing. They could not give up. Not now. Not ever. "We fight," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We fight for every person on this planet, for the ones we've lost, and for the hope that humanity will be enough." The night stretched on, the sound of distant explosions echoing through the valley, a reminder of the chaos closing in. The rebels prepared for the battle of their lives, knowing that the first encounter with the Hyrex would be a test of everything they had left. But with humanity's ships still above them, the question remained, would they be enough to turn the tide of war? Taryn's mind raced. They had only days. The Hyrex had always been unpredictable, their attack strategies ruthless. There was no way of knowing if humanity could get here in time to make a difference. We'll have to hold the line until they arrive, Terran said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. We can't let the T-Rex destroy us before humanity gets here. We fight with everything we have. The rebels nodded in agreement, their faces grim but determined. They had already seen too much suffering, and they weren't about to let their world fall without a fight. Later that night, Terran stood alone outside the bunker, staring at the dark sky above. The stars twinkled, distant and cold. Somewhere out there, the ships from Earth were on their way. But as she looked into the vast expanse, she couldn't help but wonder if the promise of help was enough. What if the T-Rex launched their final attack before humanity arrived? What if the humans didn't have the strength to fight back against the overwhelming power of the T-Rex? Stay strong, Terran whispered, trying to reassure herself. Stay strong for them, for our people. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the bunker grew. Every rebel seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next sign. Would the ships come? Would humanity's forces really arrive in time? Then, just as hope began to fade, Jace rushed into the room, his face pale and wide-eyed. They're here, he shouted. The ships. I can see them. Terran's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Jace outside. The sky was still dark, but now there were bright flashes of light cutting through the night. In the distance, a fleet of ships appeared, human ships, their sleek, powerful designs unmistakable. The rebels gasped in disbelief, their eyes wide with awe. They really came, Terran whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Humanity had answered their call. But just as they began to cheer, Terran's gaze turned wary. She could see the ships, but she couldn't hear them. There were no sounds of their engines roaring toward the planet's surface, no signs of a full-scale invasion. The ships hovered in orbit, not moving closer. They're not landing, Jace said, his voice filled with confusion. Terran's heart dropped as realization struck. Something was wrong. Humanity had responded, but there was still a sense of unease in the air. The ships hadn't come close enough to fight, and the T-Rex weren't far behind. The battle was only just beginning, and they would need to prepare for whatever came next. The message had given them hope, but hope was just the beginning. Now they had to fight. The first encounter. The ships hung in the sky like distant stars, silent and unmoving. The rebels watched them from the ruins of Iroth, their hearts racing, unsure of what to make of the sight. Humanity's fleet had arrived, but they weren't coming down to the surface as expected. The ships hovered high above, out of reach, their sleek forms gleaming under the pale light of Kaldor's dying sun. Captain Terran's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. This wasn't the rescue they had imagined. The promise of salvation now seemed uncertain. Humanity had sent help, but why weren't they landing? Had something gone wrong? Were they just waiting for the right moment to strike? We need answers, Terran said, turning to Jace. Get in touch with them. Now. Jace nodded, his hands trembling as he moved to the console, furiously typing commands to establish a direct link with the human fleet. The air in the bunker was thick with tension. Every rebel in the room stood still, watching him with bated breath. They had been waiting for this moment for so long, and now it felt like everything was hanging by a thread. Come on, Jace muttered, his fingers flying over the keys. Jace turned back to the console, typing furiously as he tried to make sense of the message. I can't get anything else from the transmission. It was too damaged. Terran looked at the screen, frustration creeping into her thoughts. She wished she knew more, wished she could somehow communicate with Earth directly, understand how humanity would get here, how they would fight the T-Rex, and whether they could really win this war. But there were no answers, only silence. Get ready, Terran said, her voice hardening with resolve. We have to be prepared to fight. The T-Rex are coming for us, and we won't go down without a fight. But this time, we fight with the knowledge that help is on the way. The rebels nodded, their faces set with determination. They had faced death before, but this time they weren't alone. Humanity had heard their cry for help, and they were coming. But Terran couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that HFY had been relentless, and the countdown to their final strike was ticking down faster than they could prepare. The message from Earth had been a spark of hope, but was it enough to save them? As the rebels gathered their weapons and prepared for battle, Terran stood at the front, staring at the screen where the transmission had ended. She didn't know if the humans would make it in time, but there was no turning back now. Their world, their fight, and their future all depended on that one desperate message. "Hold the line," Terran whispered to herself as the sound of footsteps and weapons filled the room. Humanity is coming, but will they be enough? The awakening of hope. The small rebel base beneath the ruins of Iroth was quiet, save for the distant sounds of explosions echoing through the valley. Outside, the HFY were tightening their grip on the planet, leaving no place untouched by their reign of terror. The rebels had fought hard, but now, as the hours passed, their options were running out. Captain Terran stood near the command console, staring at the blinking lights on the screen. She could still hear the faint echoes of the message from Earth in her mind. Humanity is coming. It had been hours since the transmission, and the rebels were beginning to lose hope. The message had been garbled, its contents unclear. Had the humans truly received their plea, or had the transmission simply been a cruel joke, a faint spark of hope in the darkness? "We have to hold on," Terran muttered to herself, pacing in the small, dimly lit room. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the message, something that they hadn't fully understood. She had to believe that humanity would come through. Jace, the young rebel who had helped send the message, sat hunched over a console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm trying to get another signal from Earth," he said, his voice tight with concentration. Maybe the message was damaged, but there could be something we missed. Terran walked over to him, peering at the screen. "Anything?" Jace sighed. "Nothing so far. The interference is too strong, but I'm not giving up. We're getting close. We have to." Suddenly, the screen flickered. For a moment, everything went black, and the rebels held their breath. Then the static cleared, and a voice crackled through the speakers. "Kaldor, this is Earth. We've received your call. Help is on the way. We are sending ships to your location. Stay strong." Terran's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. The voice was clearer this time, and though the transmission was still broken, the message was unmistakable. "Humanity is coming," she whispered, feeling the weight of the words. The rebels, who had been standing in silence, now erupted into cheers and applause. For the first time in years, they felt something they hadn't dared hope for, a future. But as Terran looked around, she noticed something in the back of her mind, unease. The HFY were a powerful force, and even with humanity's help, would they be able to win? The message had given them new hope, but it was far from a guarantee. Time was still running out. "Jace, how long until the ships arrive?" Terran asked, trying to push her doubts aside. Jace typed quickly, his brow furrowing as he analyzed the data. The transmission didn't say exactly when, but judging by the signals we're picking up, the ships are likely still several days away. But I'm not sure how much time we have before the HFY strike. The silent desperation. The planet of Kaldor was dying. The once thriving world, with its lush forests and bustling cities, was now a wasteland. The skies were choked with smoke, and the ground was cracked and barren. The alien invaders, known as the HFY, had conquered the planet with brutal force, enslaving its people and tearing apart everything they held dear. In the capital city of Iroth, a small group of rebels huddled together in a dark, hidden underground bunker. Among them was Captain Terran, the leader of the resistance. She was a woman hardened by years of conflict, her eyes sharp and unyielding, but even she could not hide the worry etched on her face. "We have no time left," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. The Tyrex are planning their final strike. If we don't get help soon, there will be no planet left to save. Her words hung heavy in the air. The rebels had fought tooth and nail for years, but the Tyrex were an unstoppable force. They had taken over the world's major cities, enslaved the people, and destroyed any hope of resistance. Now, only a handful of rebels remained, scattered and hiding in the shadows. But there was still one option left, the only one that hadn't been tried yet. "We need to send the message," Turin said, turning to a young rebel at a computer station in the corner of the room. "Now." The rebel, Jace, nodded and quickly typed into the keyboard, sending out a distress signal to the stars. It was their final hope, humanity. The message had been sent to Earth, hoping that some part of the human race might hear it and come to their aid. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. "We have to believe they'll respond," Jace said, his voice filled with uncertainty. Turin's eyes flickered with doubt. The message they had sent was not a simple plea for help. It was a desperate cry from a dying planet, a final attempt to reach anyone who might come to their aid. The human race had never interacted with Kaldor before. The aliens who ruled the galaxy kept the humans isolated, and for all they knew, Earth might not even know about their existence. But if there was one thing Terran had learned in this war, it was that hope was all they had left. And sometimes, hope could be enough. As Jace finished sending the transmission, the room fell silent. The rebels gathered around, watching the screen, waiting for any sign that their message had been received. The clock was ticking, and the Tyrex were getting closer. It had been weeks since the rebels had last fought in a major battle, and the silence only made the tension worse. Every minute felt like an hour. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a small beep from the console. A new message had arrived. The rebels' eyes widened with anticipation as Jace scrambled to open it. Terran's breath caught in her throat as the message began to play. It was a garbled transmission, crackling with static. The words were difficult to make out, but one thing was clear. This was a response. Message. Received. Humanity. Coming. Aid. The words were fragmented, but they were enough. Humanity had heard their plea. Someone out there, somewhere in the vastness of space, had decided to help. "Did you hear that?" Jace whispered, his voice filled with awe. "They're coming. Humanity is coming." Terran felt a surge of hope like she hadn't felt in years. She had always believed that one day someone would come to help, but hearing it confirmed, hearing those words from Earth itself, was something else entirely. But as the transmission continued, the message took on a darker tone. Arrival. In days. But enemy. Preparing. Strike. Soon. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the room in stunned silence. Terran's heart pounded in her chest. The message had confirmed what they had feared, that Tyrex were not waiting. The enemy was preparing to launch their final attack on Kaldor, and they had only days to defend their planet before it was lost forever. "Days," Terran muttered, her voice grim. "We don't have long." The rebels began to panic, their voices rising in a mix of fear and excitement. They had sent out their message, and now help was on the way. But the clock was ticking, and they were running out of time. "What if they don't get here in time?" one of the rebels asked, fear creeping into his voice. "They will," Terran replied firmly, though her mind raced with doubts. "Humanity won't abandon us. They have to help."